I do think there's a degree of truth in that, both in the stages and the amount of money that they will give to a company. They often will drip feed more money into a business even within a round rather than giving all the money at one time. But I think the most significant way you see that is in the attitude to failure of founders. In the US, if you've started a business before and it's failed, it can be almost seen as a badge of honor as long as you've actually learned from it. Then that's great, and now you get to have another go. Whereas in Europe, you see very few founders who failed being given a second chance by investors. And it's the ones that have succeeded, even sometimes if some of that has been a little bit lucky, that actually get the second chance. So I think that's the biggest difference in terms of an attitude to risk that exists between the two sides of the Atlantic. The European tech scene suffers from a challenge of fragmentation that China and the US don't suffer from. I don't think it's any coincidence that a lot of the really large, successful internet-based businesses have come out of the US and China. They can both grow pretty big without ever having to go beyond one language, one set of regulation. And European businesses have to deal with a lot more complexity far earlier in their growth cycle. And I do think that makes life far more difficult for them. It's an interesting question to consider why European businesses seem to sell out earlier than US ones do. I think some of that has to do with aspiration and levels of role model. I mean, in the Valley, you're nothing if you haven't bought a vineyard in Napa Valley. And whereas in Europe, people are prepared to sell out for the 10 million life-changing, I don't need to work again amount of money. And so I think there is a different attitude in terms of the aspiration of founders, but also the availability of rounds of capital. It's quite hard to get the very large round that might take you from being the 50 million turnover business up to the multi-hundreds of millions of turnover, and therefore dramatically alter your valuation. So I think it's partly about availability of capital and partly about levels of aspiration. There is a shortage of talent in Europe. I think there's a shortage of talent globally. We just don't educate and train enough people with the right skills for the kind of economy that we're going to be running in the future. So I think there's a global shortage, and that's a huge challenge to every country. I think Europe is becoming a much more attractive place to live. You know, Barcelona, Berlin, London are all places that people now want to go and live and work. So I think the Valley, the attraction of the Valley is still there, but I think it's declining slightly, partly because it's so expensive to live there, but also just because there are actually some really good, really exciting businesses growing up in Europe that people feel they can go and build a career with. I think it will. I think it's a question of time. It's a question of aspiration of a CEO who's willing to say no to the offer that might otherwise be attractive. I mean, you look at Facebook, you look at Twitter, all of those ones that have gone on to become the sort of super unicorns. They've all said no to what might have looked attractive offers some point earlier in their development. So I think it's a question of time, aspiration and funding support, and it's no coincidence again that you're seeing some of the big US VC firms come over here and start to invest as leaders of rounds or in large rounds, like Sequoia invested in Skyscanner last year. And with that money coming in to support the next level of growth and aspiration for the founder, it's just a question of time. When? That's very difficult to determine, because value is in the eyes of the beholder, especially when it comes to a tech buyout, and therefore it's very hard to say when someone will perceive a European business as having that kind of value to them, and or an IPO alternatively comes out at a skyrocket kind of valuation.